959 is a car that bristled with technology when it came out over 30 years ago. It fascinated then and it fascinates now. The 959 is a superstar amongst Porsche's back catalogue, and it forms the genetic link between the 911 of old and the 911 of today. For Porsche, the 959 was to become a sports car of superlatives, to give its owner the thresholds in performance of a racing car, but the comfort, interior noise level and refinement of a saloon car of the time. In 1982, the FIA turned out a new book of rules for rallying, which would become Group B, a class that would see some of the world's most powerful and frightening rally cars compete head-to-head in the World Rally Championship, and Porsche wanted to be a part of that. They had the engines and the output was ready, but to harness that kind of power and torque, they needed a driveline which went to all four wheels, and that had not yet been developed. Three of Porsche's key engineers, Peter Falk, Roland Karsmal and Helmuth Bott, decided that the Paris-Dakar Rally, which was still in its infancy, would be a perfect theatre and proving ground to turn an idea for an all-wheel drive 911 into a competition reality. In spring of 1983, at the Aero proving ground, a proving ground for tanks and military equipment in West Germany, the first 953 prototype went into action. A car which was fundamentally a 3.2 litre Carrera with the beginnings of the PSK torque variable all-wheel drive system, was put through its paces to a point by Karsmal where they broke every single component in the suspension and driveline and then repaired it and broke it again and repaired it until it wouldn't break anymore. These foundations contributed to give Porsche a first win, first time out at the Paris-Dakar Rally, all of which contributed to the 959 and its robustness in its driveline and suspension, which would play a hugely important part in the car's legendary status, not only as the world's fastest production car, but as one of the most robust. The 953 was a successful racing car, but its engine was fairly humble. What we know now about 3.2 litre 911 engines, completely air-cooled, single overhead camshaft, played in that car, and it worked. But for Porsche to achieve what they set out to do, they would need a lot more horsepower. And the way that they achieved that was by borrowing an engine from racing practice that we had been familiar with. The engine in the 959 found its roots in the flame-spitting 935 that was born in the 70s. That engine evolved into what we know as the power source for multiple Le Mans victories in cars like the 956 and the 962. That engine was a 2.8 litre flat six, everything we're used to so far, with twin overhead camshafts per bank, air-cooled crankcase and barrels, but water-cooled heads. Those cylinder heads being one piece, unlike air-cooled 911s that used single or three-piece cylinder heads. The necessity for water cooling came from great thermal demands because they were four-valve heads, and the necessity to keep them cool could not be kept up with by the traditional fan and distribution of atmospheric air. The racing cars used parallel turbocharging, which means a turbocharger on each bank of cylinders, both spinning at the same time, producing their boost together. That's fine for running a car around Le Mans for an entire day at maximum revs. Parallel turbocharging generated all of its power, its maximum boost at high revs. Fine for a racing car. For a road car that needed to be civilized and have a linear power curve from idle all the way up to its maximum revs, different thinking had to be employed, and that's where the 959 became clever. The process of sequential turbocharging ensured that the car had a very linear power curve. Below 4,300 revs, exhaust gas was channeled through one small turbocharger, and above that point, the bypass ran both turbochargers, thus giving the 959 a power curve which enabled it to be driven conventionally and in a civilized way, and turned it into an animal when that was demanded of it by its driver. To build the world's fastest road car, aerodynamics is not a small part of the conversation, and consequently, albeit this car does look like a 911, there's no doubt that this is a Porsche, but the thrust that had to be engaged with this car was reduction of drag and reduction of lift, to which Porsche achieved zero, no lift whatsoever, and 0.31 coefficient of resistance, numbers that helped the car achieve its top speed. They did this by thinking outside the box. First and foremost, the car's monocoque is almost entirely created from composites. Kevlar on the external skin, the floors were made of Nomex, There are many, many similarities to a 911 if you look closely. All of the car's glazing is the same as a 911 of the time, and some pieces like the scuttle and the A-pillars inside the doors will look identical to what they did on a production 911. However, to keep everything as low and as light as possible, much time was spent in the wind tunnel and in prototypes, 31 of them, to make sure that Porsche set out to achieve what they wanted. The aerodynamic concerns did not skip one single part of the car, albeit this car doesn't have them. Even the concern of drag around the wheels was attended to by special wheel covers. In this car, one thing which is blatantly obvious is the car's very interesting magnesium wheels, hollow spoked, containing or sharing the air and the pressure that was in the tyre, and utilising a small canister inside the wheel or a chamber which held air at the specified tyre pressure, and which, if it changed from the air in the rest of the tyre, would alert the driver via an LED in the instrument panel. This being the pilot for what we've come to be used to today and take for granted, our modern tyre pressure monitoring system, something that was necessary for a car that could cruise on the Autobahn at over 300 kilometres an hour. It is absolutely a 911 in terms of its genetics, but externally, it only shares several components with the 911 of the time: the corner taillight assemblies, the engine vent cover, and the external door handles. Once we get into the cabin, things become altogether more familiar, especially if you've been in a 1980s Porsche of some description. The door furniture, window switches, the stalks for the lights and the wipers, and indeed the instrument panel are very similar to a 911 of the time. The steering wheel looks like it's been lifted out of a 928, but it's the details that set the 959 apart from its contemporary Porsche models. For example, if you look in the instrument panel with its 5 instruments pointed directly at the driver, where there is normally an analog clock, there is a multifunction gauge that tells the driver the percentage bias of drive between the rear and front axles, for starters. And then back up on the column, behind the washer control, you'll find a new stalk, one which was there dedicated to the car's four-wheel drive program system. Looking down onto the console is where things become very different. Some of the 959 systems required extra switchgear to be fitted to the car, and the console lent itself perfectly to the damper control setting, the car's ride height as well being attenuated from this section, and if one looks really closely they will notice one of the things that sets the 959 apart, and that is the little G on the shifter. The 959's gearbox had a Gelände mode, or terrain mode in English. This enabled what would become the world's fastest road car to be raised on its suspension and engage a gear which was lower than first gear to tackle light terrain. Fascinating for a car that was intended to be as aerodynamic, as fast in a straight line possible, and to possess the qualities of a racing car. Reassuringly, so much of what I showed you in the 959 is still here today in almost every modern Porsche. The instrument layout, for example, still has the tachometer front and centre. In 992, it's the only remaining analogue instrument, the rest being digital and customisable. The torque split display, like I showed you in the 959, is still here. In all of our four-wheel drive models, SUVs and the sports cars, you can see where the torque is being biased automatically by the car as you drive it. Like the 959, the centre console has become a prominent feature of the interior, not just of 911, but of all of our cars. It brings all of the secondary controls to a level which is convenient and safe for the driver to access them. Controls for secondary functions and primary functions have all been now concentrated into a beautiful digital 10.9-inch display, for which the driver and the passenger can access settings for the navigation, the chassis controls, and indeed climate control settings from one convenient location in the centre of the car. And so you may ask, what is the relevance of a modern 911 in a discussion that is fundamentally about the 959? Well, we have said before that the 959 is like the link between the 911 of old and the 911 of today. And it did it at the time by launching technology that was unheard of and unseen. The 959 had 7 control units. A 992 today has dozens. 34 years ago, 450 horsepower was a very big number. The 959 had a lot more horsepower than other 911s in the range, certainly a lot more horsepower than other sports cars, and its power unit, as we discussed, was lifted nearly wholesale out of a racing car. Today, we can achieve 450 horsepower throughout the 911 range with relative ease, and it comes down a lot to the way that the turbochargers are managed. The 959 was turbocharged sequentially. The 992 has gone back to parallel systems. The turbochargers are now a mirror image of each other, which means that the gas flow on each side of the engine is identical to each other. The wastegate controls are managed by electronic stepper motors that are actually built into the turbocharger bodies on either side of the engine. So as you can now appreciate, the marvel that was the 959 was the culmination, it was a melting pot of many good ideas, and Porsche's pursuit of several racing campaigns in the 80s to win Le Mans, which they did multiple times, and to set out to win the Paris-Dakar Rally, to which they conquered. And all of those ideas came together and showed the technical prowess of the company in this car, the 959.